Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the leather boots of a medieval servant, and I can already tell you're not going to like where this is headed. Picture this. It's 1347, somewhere in the English countryside, and you've just been hired as a servant in Lord Aldrich's manor house. The morning mist clings to the stone walls like a damp shroud, and you're about to discover that your romanticized notions of medieval life are about as accurate as a blindfolded archer. You probably think you could handle hauling some water and sweeping a few floors, but trust me, you'd be begging for your modern conveniences before the rooster even thinks about crowing. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our little global community of history nerds and insomniacs. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wooden shutters of your cramped servants' quarters creak open, but there's no gentle sunlight streaming through. It's still pitch black outside, and the only light comes from a flickering rushlight that's been burning since midnight. Your fellow servants are already stirring in the straw-filled pallets around you, their movements creating a symphony of groans and the rustle of coarse woolen blankets. The air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and something indefinably sour that you're beginning to suspect might be your new reality. You swing your legs over the edge of your pallet, and immediately your bare feet meet the cold, packed earth floor. No hardwood, no carpet, not even proper stone, just dirt that's been trampled by countless servants before you until it's as hard as concrete and twice as unforgiving. The shock of the cold travels up your spine like an unwelcome wake-up call, and you realize that central heating is still about 600 years in the future. Margaret, the head housemaid, is already moving through the quarters like a general inspecting troops. She's been doing this for 23 years, and her face shows every single one of them. Her hands are permanently stained brown from the lye soap she uses daily, and her back has a permanent hunch from years of scrubbing floors. She doesn't need to raise her voice. The soft thud of her wooden shoes on the hard-packed floor is enough to get everyone moving. Prime bell rang 10 minutes ago. She whispers, but her whisper carries more authority than most people's shouts. Prime bell, that's the first service of the day, which means it's roughly 4 a.m. by our modern reckoning, though medieval people didn't think in terms of precise hours the way we do. Time was measured by the sun, the church bells, and the never-ending cycle of work that defined every moment of a servant's existence. You stumble toward the wooden bucket in the corner, hoping for a quick splash of water to wake yourself up, but the water is a thin layer of ice. Welcome to medieval morning hygiene, and this is actually considered the warm season. In winter, you'll be breaking through ice thick enough to support a small bird, assuming there's any water left at all and the rats haven't gotten to it first. Your clothing situation is, to put it mildly, a disaster by modern standards, but perfectly normal for a 14th century servant. You own exactly 2 outfits, the one you're wearing and the one that's currently being mended by the seamstress because yesterday you caught it on a nail and tore a hole the size of your fist. Your current ensemble consists of a rough woolen tunic that feels like it was woven from particularly vindictive sheep, woolen hose that bag around your ankles no matter how you adjust them, and leather shoes that have seen better centuries. The tunic is dyed with woad, giving it a faded blue color that's meant to hide stains. A practical choice that you'll appreciate more as the day progresses. The Great Hall is already buzzing with activity when you enter, though buzzing might be too energetic a word for the quiet efficiency of servants who know that noise before the Lord's breakfast means trouble. The massive fireplace at one end of the hall contains nothing but cold ashes. You'll be responsible for getting that fire roaring again, along with fires in the kitchen, the solar, and anywhere else warmth might be required. Medieval castles and manor houses were essentially elaborate stone refrigerators, designed more for defense than comfort, and keeping them warm was a full-time job for multiple people. Thomas, the steward, appears at your elbow like a well-dressed specter. He's the closest thing to a manager you'll encounter, responsible for overseeing all the household servants and reporting directly to the Lord. His clothing marks him as several social steps above you. His woolen tunic is finer, dyed a deep green that speaks of better vegetable dyes, and he wears a leather belt with actual metal fittings rather than rope. But don't let his relatively elevated status fool you. He started as a kitchen boy 30 years ago, and he remembers every lesson about survival in a medieval household. You'll start in the Lord's chamber. Thomas informs you, and something in his tone suggests this isn't the plum assignment you might think it is. Empty the chamber pot, sweep the rushes, check the window shutters for drafts, and lay out his morning clothes. Do not wake him unless the castle is actively burning down, and even then, consider your options carefully. The wooden tablet in Thomas's hand contains your daily assignments, scratched in wax with a stylus. Most servants couldn't read. Literacy was largely the domain of clergy and nobility, so instructions were given verbally and repeated until memorized. You're expected to remember not just what to do, but when to do it, in what order, and with what level of urgency. Forget a task, and you'll go without supper. Perform a task poorly, and you might find yourself sleeping in the stables with the horses. Historians still argue whether medieval chamber pots were emptied once or twice daily in noble households, but from a servant's perspective, the frequency hardly mattered. It was always going to be your job, and it was always going to be unpleasant. You make your way up the narrow stone staircase, each step worn smooth by centuries of feet, the walls close enough that you could touch both sides by extending your arms. The stairs are uneven. Medieval stonemasons weren't particularly concerned with standardization, and each step is a unique adventure in potential ankle twisting. The spiral staircase winds upward in a clockwise direction, a deliberate defensive design that would give right-handed defenders an advantage over right-handed attackers climbing up. But for a servant carrying chamber pots, laundry, or trays of food, these stairs are simply another obstacle in a day full of them. The stone is worn smooth in the center where countless feet have trod, creating a subtle groove that's treacherous when wet. The Lord's chamber is, by medieval standards, luxurious. There's an actual wooden floor instead of packed earth. Tapestries hang on the walls to provide insulation and decoration, and the bed is a massive four-poster affair with curtains that can be drawn for privacy and warmth. But luxury is relative, and by your modern standards, still a cold, drafty room with primitive furniture and questionable sanitation. The tapestries are works of art in their own right, depicting hunting scenes and religious imagery in rich colors that speak of expensive dyes imported from distant lands. But they also serve a practical purpose. The stone walls of medieval buildings were excellent at conducting cold, and hanging fabric provided a crucial layer of insulation. You'll learn to appreciate these tapestries not for their artistic merit, but for their ability to make your work environment marginally less frigid. Lord Aldrich is still sleeping, and you get your first close look at medieval nobility. He's not the handsome, well-groomed figure you might imagine from movies. His hair is unwashed. Bathing was considered potentially dangerous to one's health. as it was believed to open the pores and let in disease. His teeth, visible slightly through his open mouth, are stained brown and yellow, with several gaps where teeth used to be. Dental hygiene consisted mainly of chewing on aromatic herbs, and sugar was so rare and expensive that tooth decay was actually less common among the poor, who couldn't afford the sweet treats that rotted noble teeth. The morning light filtering through the shutters reveals more details of your lord's sleeping habits. His nightcap, a practical necessity in a cold stone building, has slipped to one side, revealing hair that's been cut in the distinctive medieval style short around the ears and back, longer on top. Barbers served multiple functions in medieval society, acting as surgeons and tooth pullers as well as haircutters, and their ministrations were often more endured than enjoyed. The chamber pot sits in the corner like a ceramic monument to human necessity. Medieval people were remarkably practical about bodily functions. Privacy and delicacy around such matters were luxuries they couldn't afford. The pot is thankfully covered with a wooden lid, but you can smell its contents from across the room. This particular aspect of medieval life is one that Hollywood tends to gloss over, but it was an unavoidable reality for every servant in every household. You approach the chamber pot with the resignation of someone who's about to cross a threshold from which there's no return. Lifting the wooden lid releases a wave of ammonia that makes your eyes water, and you understand immediately why chamber pot duty was assigned to the newest, lowest-ranking servants. The contents need to be carried downstairs, through the great hall, across the courtyard, and dumped in the castle's cesspit, a journey that will take you past other servants, guards, and potentially members of the lord's family. Medieval servants developed a particular walking technique for chamber pot transport, small, careful steps that minimize sloshing, combined with steady breathing through the mouth rather than the nose. It was a skill passed down from one generation of servants to the next, along with the hard-earned wisdom that accidents during chamber pot duty could result in anything from public humiliation to dismissal without references. The wooden handle of the chamber pot is worn smooth by countless hands, and you notice small nicks and scratches that tell the story of its daily use. Medieval pottery was sturdy by necessity. Replacing a broken chamber pot meant finding a potter, commissioning the work, and paying wages that might represent a week's earnings for a servant. You grip the handle carefully, understanding that clumsiness could have consequences far beyond momentary embarrassment. As you make your careful way down the stairs, pot in hand, you begin to understand that this is just the beginning of your day. The sun still hasn't risen. You've already handled human waste, and there are approximately 14 more hours of similar delights awaiting you. Margaret passes you on the stairs, carrying fresh rushes for the Lord's floor, and she gives you a look that's equal parts sympathy and amusement. Every servant remembers their first chamber pot, and every servant remembers the moment they realized that medieval life wasn't going to be the pastoral adventure they'd imagined. The great hall has transformed in the few minutes you've been upstairs. What was an empty, echoing space is now busy with servants preparing for the day ahead. The fire is being rekindled in the massive hearth, sending smoke up the chimney and warmth radiating outward. Trestle tables are being set up for the morning meal, and you can hear the distant sounds of activity from the kitchen. The cesspit, located a prudent distance from the main buildings, is a medieval engineering marvel in its own horrifying way. It's a deep pit lined with stones, designed to contain the waste of the entire household while allowing liquid to seep away into the ground. The smell hits you from 20 yards away, a combination of decomposition, ammonia, and something that might charitably be described as medieval essence. You dump the contents of the chamber pot, rinse it with water from a nearby well because yes, you'll need to carry it back upstairs for tomorrow morning's performance, and try not to think about the fact that you'll be doing this exact same thing every single day for the foreseeable future. The well water used for rinsing chamber pots isn't the same water used for drinking. Medieval people understood the basics of sanitation, even if they didn't understand the science behind it. There's a hierarchy of water sources, with the cleanest reserved for drinking and cooking, and the rest used for washing, rinsing, and other domestic purposes. You learn to appreciate these distinctions quickly when your health depends on them. Walking back toward the manor house, you notice that other servants are going about their morning routines with practiced efficiency. The kitchen maids are already preparing breakfast. Smoke is beginning to curl from various chimneys, and the day's work is unfolding with the precision of a well-rehearsed dance. You're the newcomer, the one still learning the steps, and everyone else has already accepted the realities you're just beginning to grasp. The morning air is crisp and clean compared to the indoor atmosphere you've been breathing, and for a moment you allow yourself to think that maybe the worst is behind you. The countryside stretches out beyond the manor walls, green and peaceful in the pre-dawn light, and you can almost convince yourself that there's something romantic about this medieval existence. Birds are beginning to sing in the hedgerows, and there's a timeless quality to the scene that speaks to something deep in your modern soul. But then Margaret's voice cuts through your momentary reverie, calling for you to return to the Lord's chamber for the next phase of your duties. The romantic moment evaporates like morning dew, and you realize that you're not a time-traveling tourist here to observe quaint medieval customs. You're a medieval servant, and your day of backbreaking labor in service to someone else's comfort has only just begun. Back in the Lord's chamber, you begin the process of sweeping the rushes-long grasses that served as medieval carpeting. These rushes absorbed spills, provided insulation, and helped mask the various odors that were part of daily life. But they also harbored fleas, attracted mice, and collected bits of food and other debris that created their own aromatic contributions to the room's atmosphere. Fresh rushes were a luxury, and most of the time you'd be working with rushes that had been on the floor for weeks. The kitchen hierarchy reveals itself to you like the layers of an onion, each one making your eyes water more than the last. You descend the stone steps toward the kitchen, and the temperature rises with each step, not from any welcoming warmth, but from the massive fires that burn constantly to feed a household of 43 people. The kitchen exists in a state of controlled chaos that would make a modern restaurant look like a meditation retreat, and you're about to learn that your position in this culinary ecosystem is somewhere below the scullery rats. Master William, the head cook, rules this domain with an iron ladle and a vocabulary that would make a sailor blush. He's a mountain of a man whose apron bears the stains of 1,000 meals and whose temper runs as hot as the ovens he tends. 27 years, he's been cooking for Lord Aldrich's household, and in that time he's perfected the art of reducing grown men to tears with nothing more than a withering glare and a few choice words about their competence with a paring knife. "You'll start with turnips," he announces, pointing to a basket that contains roughly 300 of the muddy, misshapen vegetables. Peel them, clean them, cut them. Try not to lose any fingers in the process, though I suppose we could always use the extra meat in the stew. His laugh sounds like gravel being poured into a wooden bucket, and you realize he's only half joking. The kitchen operates on a rigid social structure that makes medieval feudalism look positively democratic. At the top sits Master William, followed by his assistant cook, Then the various specialist servants, the baker, the brewster, the sauce cook, and finally, at the very bottom, you and the other general servants who do whatever needs doing. Speaking out of turn can earn you a cuff to the ear. Questioning an order can cost you your position. And suggesting improvements to established methods is tantamount to declaring war on centuries of tradition. Your workspace is a scarred wooden table that bears the knife marks of decades of food preparation. The wood has absorbed so many flavors, odors, and stains that it's developed its own unique ecosystem. You're provided with a knife that's been sharpened so many times it's barely wider than a needle, and you're expected to peel turnips with the precision of a surgeon and the speed of someone whose next meal depends on their productivity. Medieval turnips weren't the neat, round vegetables you might find in a modern supermarket. These are gnarled, irregular specimens that seem designed to resist your every effort at peeling. Some are the size of your fist, others no bigger than a walnut, and each one requires individual attention. The knife slips constantly on the muddy surface, and within minutes your hands are cramped. Your back aches from bending over the table, and you've managed to peel exactly 3 turnips while the experienced kitchen maid next to you has finished an entire basket. Faster, comes a voice from over your shoulder, and you look up to see Agnes, the undercook, watching your pathetic progress with barely concealed contempt. Agnes started as a scullery maid 12 years ago and has clawed her way up the kitchen hierarchy through a combination of skill, ruthlessness, and the ability to outlast 5 different assistant cooks. She's learned that showing mercy to new servants only encourages weakness, and weakness in a medieval kitchen can bring down the entire operation. The rhythm of the kitchen begins to assert itself around you, the steady chop 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 of knives on cutting boards, the scrape of wooden spoons against iron pots, the hiss of meat hitting hot fat, and underneath it all, the constant murmur of instructions, complaints, and kitchen gossip that keeps the workers informed about everything from the Lord's mood to which servant was caught stealing bread. It's a symphony of productivity that you're desperately trying to join, but your turnip-peeling performance suggests you're playing in an entirely different key. The kitchen's physical layout is a masterpiece of medieval inefficiency by modern standards. The main hearth dominates one wall, large enough for you to stand upright inside it, with iron hooks and chains suspended from the chimney for hanging pots at various heights above the flames. Smaller cooking fires are scattered around the room, each tended by different servants responsible for specific dishes. Water must be carried from the well outside. Fuel must be constantly fed to the fires, and every cooking vessel must be cleaned by hand in wooden tubs filled with water that grows progressively greasier throughout the day. Historians still argue whether medieval kitchens were more efficient than modern ones when accounting for the number of people fed per worker. But what's not debatable is that every single person in that kitchen had to justify their existence through constant, visible productivity. There was no hiding behind busy work or stretching out simple tasks. Food needed to be prepared, and it needed to be prepared correctly, on time, and in sufficient quantity to feed everyone from the Lord's family to the lowliest stable boy. The fire management alone would challenge a modern chef. Medieval cooks worked with open flames, no temperature controls, and wood that might be green or seasoned, dry or damp, depending on what the woodcutters had available. Master William can judge the heat of his fires by holding his hand at various distances from the flames, a skill that took years to develop and countless burned meals to master. You, meanwhile, are expected to tend a smaller fire that's roasting a joint of pork, and you've already let it burn on one side while remaining raw on the other. The social dynamics of the kitchen reveal themselves through the way ingredients are distributed and controlled. The spice cabineta locked wooden chest bound with iron represents a treasure trove worth more than some servants earn in a year. Pepper, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg were luxury items imported from distant lands, and their use was strictly regulated by Master William himself. As the newest servant, you're not even allowed to look at the spice cabinet directly, let alone touch its precious contents. Agnes demonstrates the proper turnip peeling technique with the casual expertise of someone who has performed this task thousands of times. Her knife moves in smooth, confident strokes, removing the skin in long spirals that leave behind perfectly uniform surfaces. The secret, she explains with the patience of someone teaching a particularly slow child, is to let the knife do the work. You're fighting it instead of guiding it. The kitchen operates on a complex system of timing that coordinates the preparation of multiple dishes for different meals throughout the day. While you struggle with your turnips, other servants are preparing ingredients for the midday meal, starting preparations for the evening feast, and cleaning up from the early morning bread baking. Every task must be completed in its proper sequence, and delays in one area can create cascading problems throughout the entire operation. Your turnip situation has become a minor crisis that threatens to disrupt the kitchen's carefully orchestrated workflow. In the time it's taken you to peel 15 turnips, you were supposed to have finished the entire basket and moved on to carrots. Agnes appears at your side again, this time with less patience and more pointed observations about your suitability for kitchen work. My grandmother could peel turnips faster than you, and she's been dead for 8 years, she remarks, demonstrating her point by peeling 3 turnips in the time it takes you to make a single cut. The kitchen's hierarchy becomes even more apparent when the baker arrives to begin preparing the day's bread. Bread making was considered a specialized skill requiring years of training, and the baker occupied a position of considerable respect within the kitchen staff. He brings with him the starter dough that's been carefully maintained for months, feeding it with fresh flour and water to keep the yeast culture alive. Medieval bakers understood fermentation processes without understanding the science behind them, relying instead on generations of accumulated knowledge passed down through apprenticeships. Medieval kitchen work required a level of knife skill that would impress modern culinary schools. These cooks could butcher an entire pig, fillet fish with surgical precision, and julienne vegetables into perfect uniform strips using nothing more than sharp steel and years of practice. Your modern experience with pre-cut, pre-packaged, and pre-processed food has left you woefully unprepared for the reality of creating meals from animals that were walking around yesterday and vegetables that still have dirt clinging to their roots. The morning meal preparation involves feeding 43 people with dietary needs that range from the Lord's refined palate to the servant's simple requirements for calories and nutrients. The Lord will dine on white bread, roasted meat, and imported spices, while the servants will eat dark bread, pottage, and whatever protein can be stretched to feed the maximum number of people. But every dish, regardless of its intended consumer, must be prepared with the same attention to detail and cleanliness that reflects the kitchen's reputation. You're assigned to stirring the large pot of potagia thick stew that serves as the primary meal for most of the household servants. The wooden paddle is as long as your arm and nearly as heavy, and stirring the pot requires constant motion to prevent the bottom from burning. Your arms begin to ache within minutes, but stopping isn't an option. Medieval pottage was made from whatever grains, vegetables, and small amounts of meat were available, and it required hours of slow cooking and constant attention to achieve the right consistency. The ingredients for pottage tell the story of medieval agriculture and food preservation. Barley forms the Basia hardy grain that grows well in poor soil and stores easily through the winter months. Dried peas add protein and substance, while whatever vegetables are in season provide variety and nutrients. Small pieces of salted pork or bacon fat add flavor and calories, though fresh meat is reserved for the Lord's table and special occasions. A peculiar medieval kitchen custom reveals itself when you accidentally knock over a small pot of salt. The reaction is immediate, and severe salt was incredibly expensive, worth more than silver in some markets, and wasting it was considered almost sacrilegious. Master William's face turns the color of a ripe beet, and for a moment you think he might actually strike you with his ladle. Instead, he assigns you to clean the kitchen floor on your hands and knees, scraping up every grain of spilled salt that can be recovered and returned to use. The floor scrubbing provides you with an intimate view of medieval kitchen hygiene that you'd rather not have experienced. The rushes on the floor harbor bits of food, spilled grease, and the occasional dead mouse that the kitchen cats haven't gotten around to collecting. Your hands, already raw from turnip peeling, now encounter every texture imaginable as you crawl around collecting precious salt crystals. The other servants step around you with the casual indifference of people who have seen new workers suffer through similar punishments. Medieval kitchens attracted vermin like modern ones attract health inspectors. They were warm, food-rich environments that provided everything a mouse or rat could want for comfortable living. The kitchen cats were working animals, valued not for their companionship but for their ability to keep the rodent population manageable. You watch one tabby stalking something behind the flour barrels, and you realize that the eternal war between cats and mice has been playing out in kitchens for centuries. The bread-making process unfolds around you like a religious ceremony, complete with rituals, traditions, and the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred occasions. The baker's assistant, still smarting from his earlier humiliation with the dropped loaves, approaches the dough with the concentration of a monk at prayer. Medieval bread was the staff of life in the most literal sense. It provided the bulk of calories for most people, and its quality could determine the difference between health and malnutrition for an entire household. Water management in the kitchen presents its own set of challenges that would mystify modern cooks. Every drop must be carried from the well outside, heated over the fire in iron cauldrons, and used efficiently for cooking, cleaning, and food preparation. There's no running water, no instant hot water heater, and no convenient drainage system. Dirty water must be carried out and disposed of properly, and the constant cycle of fetching, heating, using, and disposing of water adds hours to every kitchen task. The spice preparation area operates like a medieval pharmacy, with Agnes carefully measuring tiny amounts of precious seasonings for different dishes. Each spice requires different treatments. Some are ground fresh, others are used whole, and all are portioned out with the precision of someone who knows their exact value. You watch her work with what looks like gold dust, and you realize that some of these spices literally are worth their weight in precious metals. The kitchen's waste management system reveals the medieval obsession with using every possible scrap of food. Vegetable peelings go to feed the pigs, meat scraps are saved for the dogs, and even eggshells are crushed and used as a source of calcium for the chickens. Nothing that can possibly be eaten, fed to animals, or repurposed is allowed to go to waste. Your clumsy turnip peeling, which removes far too much edible flesh along with the skin, marks you as someone who doesn't understand the true value of food. Agnes assigns you to cleaning the iron cooking pots, a task that involves scraping away burned food with sand and salt, scrubbing with rough cloths, and somehow managing to clean surfaces that seem permanently bonded with layers of grease and char. Medieval iron was more porous than modern steel, and these pots had absorbed years of cooking residue that no amount of scrubbing could completely remove. The pots were seasoned like modern cast iron, and too much aggressive cleaning could ruin their cooking properties. The morning rush intensifies as breakfast service approaches. Servants scurry between the kitchen and the great hall, carrying trays of bread, bowls of pottage, and pitchers of ale. The coordination required to serve 43 people simultaneously with hot food and no modern warming equipment challenges every aspect of the kitchen's organization. You're assigned to carrying bread baskets, and you learn immediately that medieval servants developed a particular walking style, quick but smooth, efficient but careful, that minimized the risk of dropping precious food. The kitchen's hierarchy extends beyond just cooking duties to include complex social relationships that determine everything from work assignments to meal portions. Senior servants eat first and get the choicest portions, while newcomers like you eat last and get whatever remains. The quality of your work directly impacts your social standing, which in turn affects your living conditions, job security, and prospects for advancement within the household. Your hands are now a disaster of cuts, burns, and blisters from your first morning of kitchen work. Medieval servants developed thick calluses and scar tissue that protected them from the constant hazards of knife work, fire tending, and hot pot handling, but your soft modern hands are woefully unprepared for this level of punishment. Every surface you touch seems designed to inflict additional damage, and you begin to understand why medieval servants had such distinctive hand injuries that marked their profession as clearly as any uniform. As the morning meal service winds down and preparations for the midday meal begin, you realize that you've completed perhaps 10% of your assigned tasks and made enemies of at least half the kitchen staff. The turnip basket still mocks you with its mostly unpeeled contents. The pottage pot bears scorch marks from your inattentive stirring, and your salt-spilling incident has become kitchen legend in the span of a few hours. Medieval kitchens didn't tolerate incompetence for long, and you're beginning to suspect that your culinary career might be measured in hours rather than days. The afternoon brings you face to face with perhaps the most dreaded aspect of medieval servant Lithia reality that makes your morning chamber pot duties seem like a pleasant warm-up exercise. You're about to discover that emptying the Lord's personal waste was just the appetizer in a full-course meal of bodily function management that would make a modern sewage worker reconsider their career choices. Welcome to the wonderful world of medieval sanitation, where privacy was a luxury and dignity was something that happened to other people. Lord Aldrich has finished his midday meal and retired to his private chambers for what medieval people delicately referred to as private business. This means you're about to become intimately acquainted with every aspect of noble digestive processes, from the initial preparation of his private space to the final cleanup that nobody talks about in those romantic medieval movies. The chamber pot you dealt with this morning was child's play compared to what awaits you behind the heavy oak door of the Lord's personal garderobe. The garderobe of medieval Europe's answer to indoor plumbingus, an architectural marvel that combines engineering ambition with aromatic reality in ways that challenge both your gag reflex and your faith in human progress. Built into the castle wall with a shaft that drops straight down to a pit below, it represents the height of medieval bathroom technology. The wooden seat is worn smooth by years of noble posteriors, and the walls are decorated with tapestries that serve the dual purpose of providing warmth and absorbing odors that would otherwise overwhelm even the most hardened servant. Your duties in the garderobe go far beyond simple cleaning. You're responsible for ensuring that the Lord's private moments are conducted in maximum comfort, which means preparing fresh herbs to mask odors, providing clean linen for personal hygiene, maintaining proper ventilation by adjusting window shutters, and standing ready to assist with clothing adjustments that noble fingers apparently can't manage independently. Medieval nobles lived lives of such pampered luxury that they required assistance with bodily functions that most people managed perfectly well on their own. The herb preparation alone requires knowledge that would challenge a medieval apothecary. Different herbs served different purposes: lavender for pleasant scent, mint for digestive comfort, rosemary for purification, and a dozen other botanical remedies that were supposed to make the experience more pleasant for everyone involved. You crush these herbs between your fingers, releasing their essential oils into small cloth sachets that will be strategically placed around the garderobe. The irony isn't lost on you that you're spending more time on herb preparation than most modern people spend on their entire bathroom routine. Medieval toilet paper consisted of whatever soft materials could be found: scraps of cloth, sheep's wool, moss, or in households wealthy enough to afford such luxury, specially prepared linen cloths that would be washed and reused. Yes, you read that correctly. Medieval bathroom tissue was a reusable household item that required laundering. This adds an entirely new dimension to your laundry duties that you hadn't previously considered, and you begin to understand why medieval servants developed such strong stomachs. Lord Aldrich's personal hygiene requirements extend far beyond the garderobe itself. Medieval people understood cleanliness differently than we. He believed that too much washing opened the pores and allowed disease to enter the body, so most cleaning involved changing clothes rather than bathing skin. Your job includes helping the Lord change his linen undergarments, brushing his outer clothing to remove debris, and ensuring that his personal items are clean and properly arranged. The process of assisting a medieval lord with his toilet reveals the complex etiquette that governed every aspect of noble life. You must remain respectfully silent unless spoken to, avoid making eye contact during certain moments, and maintain an expression of professional detachment that suggests this is perfectly normal behavior. Medieval servants developed a particular facial expression: alert but unseeing, helpful but not curious, that allowed them to perform intimate duties without appearing to notice the basic humanity of their employers. Historians still argue whether medieval nobles truly required this level of assistance, or whether the elaborate rituals around basic bodily functions served primarily to reinforce social hierarchies and demonstrate wealth. What's not debatable is that refusing to provide these services meant immediate dismissal, and performing them poorly could result in public humiliation that would follow you to any future employment. Medieval letters of recommendation included detailed assessments of a servant's discretion and reliability in personal matters. The garderobe maintenance involves engineering challenges that would puzzle modern plumbers. The shaft must be kept clear of obstructions. The seat must be regularly cleaned and oiled to prevent splinters, and the herb sachets must be replaced frequently enough to control odors, but not so often as to waste expensive materials. Medieval castle builders understood ventilation principles and designed garderobes with carefully calculated airflows, but maintaining these systems required constant attention from servants who understood the delicate balance between function and comfort. Your other duties during the Lord's private time include monitoring his health through discreet observation of what medieval people considered important diagnostic information. The color, consistency, and odor of bodily waste were considered crucial indicators of overall health, and servants were expected to report any concerning changes to the household physician. This means you're not just cleaning up after medieval nobility, you're serving as an unofficial medical assistant whose observations could influence important health decisions. The medieval understanding of digestion and bodily functions was based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, whose balance determined health and temperament. Different foods, activities, and even weather patterns were believed to affect this humoral balance. And the Lord's waste products provided evidence of whether his humors were properly aligned. You're expected to understand these theories well enough to recognize when something might require the physician's attention. Personal grooming extends the intimate servant duties into areas that modern people handle entirely independently. Medieval nobles required assistance with tasks ranging from trimming fingernails to cleaning ears, and these services were performed with specialized tools that required careful maintenance and proper technique. The nail scissors are tiny works of art, hand-forged by skilled metal workers, and using them incorrectly could result in injury that might lead to infection and death in an era without antibiotics. The clothing management aspect of personal service reveals the complexity of medieval fashion and the impracticality of noble dress. Lord Aldrich's daily outfit consists of multiple layers that require assistance to put on and take off: an undershirt, tunic, hose that must be tied to the tunic with dozens of small cords, a surcoat, and various accessories that demonstrate his wealth and status. Each piece must be properly arranged, and the ties and fastenings are positioned in places that make independent dressing nearly impossible. Medieval undergarments were works of art in their own right, made from the finest linen available and constructed with seams that wouldn't chafe during long days of wear. These garments required daily changing and careful washing to maintain their appearance and hygiene. You're responsible for ensuring that clean undergarments are always available, properly pressed, and free from the wrinkles and stains that would reflect poorly on the Lord's status. The Lord's personal items include a collection of grooming tools that would impress modern beauty enthusiasts: combs carved from horn or ivory, mirrors made from polished metal, tweezers for removing unwanted hair, and small scissors for trimming beards and mustaches. Each tool has its proper use and must be cleaned and maintained according to specific procedures that preserve their effectiveness and appearance. Medieval craftsmanship produced items of incredible beauty and functionality, but they required constant care to maintain their condition. Perfume and scented oils play a crucial role in medieval personal hygiene, not just for pleasant odor but for their supposed medicinal properties. Different scents were believed to ward off disease, improve mood, and balance the humors. You mix custom blends of oils and herbs according to the Lord's preferences and the physician's recommendations, creating personalized fragrances that serve both cosmetic and health purposes. The ingredients for these preparations come from all over the known world and cost more than most servants earn in a year. The private chamber cleaning routine involves attention to details that would challenge modern housekeeping standards. Every surface must be cleaned with appropriate materials: wood polished with beeswax, metal rubbed with fine sand and oil, textiles brushed and aired to remove dust and odors. The room's atmosphere must be carefully controlled through the strategic placement of herbs, the management of drafts, and the coordination of lighting that provides adequate illumination without creating fire hazards. Waste disposal from the garderobe involves a complex system that medieval engineers designed to minimize health risks and odor problems. The contents of the shaft are periodically removed by specially designated workers, usually the lowest-ranking servants or people hired specifically for this purpose, and disposed of in locations far from the living areas. This waste was sometimes sold to farmers as fertilizer, creating an early example of recycling that turned human waste into agricultural resources. The Lord's bathing routine, when it occurs, presents challenges that make all your other duties seem simple by comparison. Medieval bathing was a rare and elaborate affair that required heating large quantities of water, preparing herbs and oils for the bath, arranging privacy screens, and ensuring that the Lord didn't catch cold during or after the process. The wooden bathtub must be lined with linen cloth, filled with water at precisely the right temperature, and scented with herbs that provide both pleasant aroma and supposed health benefits. Personal security during intimate moments requires constant vigilance that adds another layer of complexity to your duties. Medieval lords faced threats from political enemies, disgruntled servants, and family members with inheritance ambitions, making even private moments potentially dangerous. You're expected to maintain awareness of the Lord's surroundings while appearing to focus entirely on your assigned tasks, a skill that requires the kind of multitasking that would challenge modern security professionals. The evening routine involves reversing the morning's dressing process with the same attention to detail and propriety. Each piece of clothing must be carefully removed, examined for damage or stains, and properly stored or sent for cleaning. The Lord's night clothes require the same careful attention as his daily wear, and preparing him for sleep involves adjustments to room temperature, lighting, and bedding that ensure maximum comfort through the night. As you complete your duties in the Lord's private chambers, you realize that you've spent the entire afternoon engaged in activities that medieval people considered perfectly normal, but that strike you as almost incomprehensibly intimate and demeaning. The casual way that medieval nobles accepted personal services that modern people would find intrusive speaks to a completely different understanding of privacy, dignity, and the relationships between social classes. Your modern sensibilities are constantly challenged by expectations that you'll perform tasks that seem to strip away every vestige of personal boundaries and professional distance. Dawn's gray light filtering through the narrow windows reveals a sight that would make modern laundry detergent commercials look like gentle comedy sketches. You're standing in the castle's laundry area, facing what can only be described as a textile apocalypse, mountains of soiled clothing, bed linens, and personal items that represent weeks of accumulated human existence in all its aromatic glory. This isn't the kind of laundry day where you toss everything into a machine and walk away. This is medieval washing, where every stain tells a story and your hands are about to become the main characters in a 12-hour tragedy. Beatrice, the head laundress, surveys the textile carnage with the grim satisfaction of a general preparing for battle. She's been waging war against stains for 31 years, and her hands tell the story of every victory and defeat permanently wrinkled from constant submersion in caustic lye solutions, stained brown from walnut hulls used for dyeing, and scarred from the countless burns that come from handling boiling water and red-hot irons. Her back is permanently bent from years of leaning over washing tubs, and her arms are as muscled as any blacksmith's from the constant scrubbing, wringing, and lifting that define her profession. Today you'll learn why they call it the Great Washing. She announces, her voice carrying the authority of someone who has reduced grown men to tears with nothing more than a bar of lye soap and a pointed comment about their technique. The Great Washing happens every 6 weeks, when the entire household's accumulated linens, clothing, and textiles receive the full medieval treatment, a process that combines chemistry, physics, and sheer determination in proportions that would challenge modern industrial operations. The laundry area itself is a testament to medieval engineering and human endurance. Built into the castle's lower levels to take advantage of water sources and drainage, it consists of multiple rooms connected by narrow passages that allow wet workers to move between different stages of the washing process. The main washing room contains a series of wooden tubs large enough for a person to stand inside, each one positioned near drainage channels that carry away dirty water. Stone platforms provide work surfaces for scrubbing, and iron hooks suspended from the ceiling hold various tools and implements. Medieval stains weren't the simple spills and splashes that modern washing machines handle with ease. These were biological disasters that had been fermenting for weeks in the damp, cold conditions of castle life. Blood from hunting accidents and kitchen mishaps had oxidized into rust-colored patches that seemed permanently bonded to the fabric. Grease from countless meals had combined with smoke from fires to create a coating that repelled water like medieval chainmail. Wine stains had aged into complex chemical compounds that laughed at your feeble attempts to scrub them away. The washing process begins with sorting, and medieval sorting made modern laundry seem like child's play. Fabrics were separated not just by color and material, but by social status, degree of soiling, and the specific treatments each piece would require. Lord Aldrich's silk-trimmed tunics received different handling than the rough woolen clothing of stable workers, and the ladies' delicate linen undergarments required techniques that wouldn't damage their fine weave or expensive embroidery. Your first assignment involves the Lord's personal linen sheets, pillowcases, and undergarments that have absorbed weeks of medieval life in the most intimate ways possible. The smell hits you like a physical blow, a combination of human sweat, various bodily secretions, and the mustiness that comes from sleeping in unheated stone rooms. Medieval people changed their bed linens far less frequently than we do, partly because washing was such an enormous undertaking and partly because they believed that too much washing weakened fabric fibers. The water preparation alone requires hours of backbreaking labor that begins before dawn and continues throughout the washing day. Every drop must be carried from the well in wooden buckets that grow heavier with each trip, heated over fires that must be constantly tended, and maintained at specific temperatures for different washing stages. The castle's laundry consumes more water in a single day than some households use in a month, and managing this resource requires the organizational skills of a military quartermaster. The lye soap that serves as your primary weapon against these stains is a caustic substance that would horrify modern safety inspectors. Made from wood ash and animal fat through a process that takes weeks to complete, it's strong enough to dissolve organic matter and aggressive enough to remove skin from your hands if you're not careful. Medieval laundresses developed thick calluses and learned to work quickly to minimize their exposure to the soap's corrosive effects. But your soft modern hands are about to receive an education in medieval chemistry that no amount of hand lotion can prepare you for. The soap-making process itself reveals the complex chemistry that medieval people understood through centuries of trial and error. Wood ash from specific trees produces different qualities of lye-oak ash creates a stronger solution than pine, and beech ash produces soap that's gentler on fine fabrics. The fat must be fresh and properly rendered, and the mixing process requires precise timing and temperature control that skilled soapmakers guard as trade secrets. A batch of bad soap can ruin an entire washing day and destroy valuable textiles. Historians still argue whether medieval washing techniques were actually more effective than early modern methods, but there's no debate about the physical demands they placed on the workers. Every piece of fabric had to be scrubbed by hand against wooden washboards or smooth stones, wrung out by twisting and pressing, and rinsed multiple times in fresh water that had to be carried from wells or streams. The process required the kind of upper body strength that modern gym-goers spend months developing, and you're expected to maintain this level of exertion for 12 straight hours. The washing tubs themselves are wooden barrels cut in half, large enough for you to stand inside if necessary, and filled with water that must be heated over fires and maintained at specific temperatures for different washing stages. cold water for initial soaking, warm water for soap application, hot water for the main washing, and progressively cooler water for rinsing. Managing these temperature transitions while handling wet, heavy fabrics challenges both your organizational skills and your ability to avoid serious burns. The initial soaking process reveals stains that have been hiding beneath layers of dirt and grime. As the fabric absorbs water, colors emerge that tell stories of medieval life: yellow patches from urine stains, brown spots from blood and rust, green discoloration from moss and mold, and mysterious black marks that could be anything from ink to soot to substances you prefer not to identify. Each stain requires individual assessment and treatment, and experienced laundresses can diagnose the source of most stains by their appearance, smell, and behavior in water. Medieval stain removal involved techniques that combined folk wisdom with practical chemistry in ways that sometimes produced miraculous results and sometimes made problems worse. Blood stains were treated with cold water and salt, but only if caught. Early old blood required soaking in urine, whose ammonia content broke down the proteins that bonded the stain to the fabric. Wine stains might be treated with white wine, lemon juice, or crushed berries that contained natural acids. Grease stains required patience, multiple soap applications, and sometimes the use of fuller's earth, a clay that absorbed oils. The physical process of washing large items like bed sheets and tapestries requires coordination that would challenge modern moving crews. These pieces, when wet, weigh as much as a small person and must be lifted, manipulated, and wrung out without tearing the fabric or injuring yourself. Medieval laundresses developed specific techniques for handling wet textiles: particular grips, leverage points, and body positions that distributed the weight and stress effectively. Your hands are already raw from the morning's work, but the day is far from over. The soap has stripped away your natural skin oils, leaving your hands dry and cracked, and the constant submersion in water has wrinkled your fingers until they look like medieval raisins. Beatrice notices your distress with the casual indifference of someone who has seen hundreds of new workers learn these lessons the hard way. "Rub your hands with goose fat tonight," she advises, "and try not to get the soap in any open cuts unless you enjoy screaming." The medieval understanding of fabric care was surprisingly sophisticated, based on centuries of accumulated knowledge about different materials and their properties. Wool required different treatment than linen. Silk demanded special handling techniques, and various dyes reacted differently to soap and water. A skilled laundress could identify fabric types by touch, predict how different stains would respond to treatment, and adjust washing techniques to preserve both the appearance and structural integrity of expensive textiles. Wool washing presents particularly complex challenges because the fabric can shrink, felt, or lose its texture if handled incorrectly. The water temperature must be carefully controlled. Too hot and the wool fibers contract permanently. Too cool and the natural oils don't release properly. Medieval laundresses developed techniques for washing woolen garments that involved minimal agitation and precise temperature control that would impress modern textile experts. Color bleeding presents challenges that make modern washing seem foolproof by comparison. Medieval dyes were often unstable, and mixing the wrong fabrics in wash water could result in expensive clothing being ruined beyond repair. Red dyes made from madder root were particularly notorious for bleeding onto other fabrics, and blue dyes from woad could turn entire loads of washing an unexpected shade of green. You learn to test each piece individually, watching for signs of color release that might contaminate other items. The dye testing process involves dampening a small, inconspicuous area of each garment and pressing it against a white cloth to check for color transfer. Some medieval dyes were so unstable that they began bleeding the moment they contacted water, while others remained stable until exposed to soap or heat. Experienced laundresses could predict which dyes would bleed based on their color intensity, the type of fabric, and the age of the garment. The wringing process reveals the upper body strength that medieval work demanded from everyone, regardless of gender or social status. Twisting wet fabric to remove excess water requires grip strength that would impress modern rock climbers, and the repetitive motion quickly leads to muscle fatigue that makes your arms feel like they're made of overcooked pasta. Medieval laundresses developed forearms like medieval warriors, and their grip strength was legendary among people who understood the physical demands of their profession. The technique for wringing large pieces requires two people working in coordination, each taking one end of the fabric and twisting in opposite directions while maintaining tension that removes water without tearing the material. Communication is crucial. Too much force and expensive fabric tears. Too little and the piece remains waterlogged and takes days to dry. You learn to read your partner's movements and adjust your own technique accordingly. Drying presents its own set of challenges in the unpredictable English climate. Wet clothing and linens must be hung where they'll receive maximum air circulation and sunlight while being protected from sudden rain showers that could undo hours of washing work. The castle's courtyards and gardens become forests of hanging fabric, with elaborate systems of ropes and poles that allow maximum use of available space. You learn to read weather signs with the intensity of a medieval farmer, because a sudden storm could destroy an entire day's work. The drying systems themselves are engineering marvels that maximize the use of space and wind patterns around the castle. Clotheslines are strung between buildings at different heights to catch breezes from various directions, and adjustable poles allow laundresses to raise or lower hanging items based on weather conditions. Indoor drying areas near the kitchen fires provide backup options when outdoor drying isn't possible, though the smoke from cooking fires can add new odors to freshly washed fabrics. The medieval laundry area attracts its own ecosystem of insects and small animals drawn by the warmth of the fires and the moisture from the washing process. Wasps build nests in the rafters above the drying lines. Mice nest in piles of dirty clothing, and various beetles and moths feast on the organic stains that coat unwashed textiles. Working in this environment requires constant vigilance against creatures that see you as either a threat to their territory or a convenient landing platform. Medieval ironing involved heated metal implements that would terrify modern safety inspectors. Flat irons were heated in the fire until they glowed red-hot, then used to press wrinkles from fabric while the metal was still hot enough to cause serious burns. The skill required to judge the correct temperature, apply the right amount of pressure, and move the iron smoothly across fabric without scorching it took years to develop. Your first attempts at ironing result in scorch marks that will serve as permanent reminders of your inexperience. The ironing process requires not just skill but also sophisticated temperature judgment that medieval workers developed through experience and burned fingers. Different fabrics require different heat levels. Linen can withstand very hot irons, while silk burns at temperatures that barely warm linen. The irons themselves must be carefully maintained, kept clean and smooth to avoid snagging delicate fabrics, and heated evenly to prevent hot spots that could burn holes in expensive clothing. The social hierarchy of the laundry area mirrors the broader household structure, with experienced workers receiving the best assignments and newest servants relegated to the most unpleasant tasks. You find yourself assigned to washing the kitchen linens, cloths soaked with grease, food scraps, and various kitchen disasters that have been fermenting in baskets for weeks. The smell alone is enough to trigger your gag reflex, and the actual washing process challenges your determination to complete your assigned duties. Kitchen linens present the most challenging washing tasks because they've absorbed every type of stain imaginable: grease from roasted meats, wine from spilled goblets, blood from butchered animals, flour from bread making, and mysterious substances that defy identification. These cloths often require multiple washing cycles, special pre-treatments, and techniques that push the limits of what soap and water can accomplish. Medieval laundresses developed a particular rhythm for their work: a steady, sustainable pace that allowed them to maintain productivity throughout the 12-hour washing day without completely exhausting themselves. You struggle to find this rhythm, alternating between frantic bursts of activity that leave you breathless and periods of near collapse that earn disapproving looks from more experienced workers. The physical demands of medieval work required a different approach to energy management than modern people typically understand. The economics of medieval laundry reveal the true value placed on textiles in a world where everything was made by hand. A single linen sheet represented weeks of work, from growing the flax to spinning the thread to weaving the fabric, and destroying it through careless washing could cost a servant their position. Expensive fabrics like silk or fine wool were treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics, and the techniques used to clean them were guarded secrets passed down through generations of skilled workers. Water quality adds another variable to the medieval washing equation. Different water sources produced different washing results. Soft water from streams worked better with soap. Hard water from wells required different techniques. And water contaminated with iron or other minerals could stain fabrics in unexpected ways. Medieval laundresses developed expertise in water evaluation that would impress modern chemists, and they knew exactly which water sources produced the best results for different types of washing. The day's washing concludes with your hands looking like they've been through a medieval torture device, your back aching from hours of bending over washing tubs, and your clothes soaked with water, soap, and various fluids that you prefer not to identify. But the work isn't finished. Tomorrow there will be more stains, more fabrics, and more opportunities to learn why medieval people considered clean clothing such a luxury. You're beginning to understand that laundry day wasn't just about cleaning clothes. It was about surviving an industrial process that used human muscle power to achieve results that challenged the limits of pre-industrial technology. The pre-dawn darkness carries an electric tension that makes your stomach clench with anticipation. Because today isn't just another day of routine medieval misery. Today is feast preparation day. In 3 days' time, Lord Aldrich will host a banquet for 47 guests to celebrate his daughter's betrothal, and you're about to discover that preparing a medieval feast requires the organizational skills of a modern military operation combined with the physical endurance of an Olympic athlete and the patience of a medieval saint. Spoiler alert: you possess none of these qualities. Master William stands in the kitchen like a general surveying a battlefield, his weathered hands holding a wax tablet covered with scratched notations that represent 3 days of coordinated chaos. His eyes have the slightly manic gleam of someone who has spent weeks planning every detail of an event that could either enhance his reputation or destroy his career, depending on whether the roasted peacock emerges from the oven looking magnificent or resembling a feathered disaster. The feast menu alone reads like a medieval fantasy novel: roasted swan, venison pasties, subtleties shaped like castles, and enough side dishes to feed a small army. Listen carefully. Master William announces to the assembled kitchen staff, his voice carrying the authority of someone who has survived 17 feast preparations and lived to tell the tale. We have 3 days to prepare 47 different dishes for 68 people, including dietary restrictions, religious requirements, and the personal preferences of guests whose displeasure could cost us our positions. The margin for error is precisely zero, and the consequences of failure range from public humiliation to permanent banishment from decent employment. The feast preparation begins with what medieval cooks called the Great Accounting, an inventory process that would challenge modern supply chain managers. Every ingredient must be counted, every portion calculated, and every cooking vessel assigned to specific dishes according to a complex schedule that coordinates timing, oven space, and human resources. You're handed a wooden tablet and stylus and assigned to count eggs, a task that sounds simple until you realize that different dishes require different types of eggs from different birds, and mixing them up could ruin recipes that take days to prepare. Medieval feast menus weren't just about food, they were elaborate displays of wealth, power, and sophistication that communicated social messages as complex as modern diplomatic protocols. The arrangement of dishes, the order of service, and even the decorative elements sent specific signals about the host's status, the guest's importance, and the household's capability. Master William explains these nuances with the intensity of someone teaching military strategy, because in many ways, that's exactly what feast preparation represented. Your egg-counting assignment reveals the complexity of medieval poultry management that makes modern grocery shopping seem laughably simple. Chicken eggs will be used for custards and binding agents, duck eggs for the rich pastries that demonstrate the household's sophistication, goose eggs for the massive meat pies that serve as centerpiece dishes, and quail eggs for the delicate garnishes that show attention to detail. Each type must be counted separately, sorted by freshness, and allocated to specific recipes according to Master William's master plan. The storage systems required for feast preparation transform the castle's lower levels into a medieval warehouse that would impress modern logistics experts. Root cellars maintain precise temperature and humidity levels for different types of produce. Salt rooms preserve meats and fish through complex curing processes, and spice chambers protect expensive seasonings from moisture and theft. You spend hours moving ingredients between storage areas according to preparation schedules that coordinate dozens of simultaneous cooking processes. Historians still argue whether medieval feasts were more about conspicuous consumption or genuine hospitality, but there's no debating the massive resources they consumed. A single feast could represent months of agricultural production, weeks of specialized labor, and expenses that equaled the annual income of entire villages. The pressure on kitchen staff to execute these events flawlessly was enormous, and careers were made or destroyed based on whether the swan emerged from the oven with its feathers properly arranged. The meat preparation alone requires butchering skills that would impress modern culinary schools. The feast menu includes a whole roasted boar, 2 deer, a swan, 3 peacocks, a dozen rabbits, and enough smaller birds to populate a medieval aviary. Each animal must be butchered according to specific techniques that maximize both the quality of the meat and the visual impact of the presentation. Medieval diners expected their food to be not just delicious but dramatically impressive. The boar processing reveals the medieval approach to using every part of an animal that makes modern nose-to-tail cooking look wasteful by comparison. The prime cuts become roasted centerpieces, the organs are ground into sausages and puddings, the bones are boiled for stocks and aspics, and even the blood is saved for black puddings that provide protein for the kitchen staff. Nothing edible is wasted, and many parts that modern people discard become featured elements of the feast menu. Medieval spice preparation involves crushing, grinding, and blending aromatics that traveled thousands of miles to reach Lord Aldrich's kitchen. peppercorns from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, nutmeg from the Spice Islands, and cloves from Southeast Asia represent trade networks that spanned continents and costs that exceeded most people's annual incomes. You're assigned to grinding spices under the watchful eye of Agnes, who treats each grain of pepper with the reverence usually reserved for precious gems. The spice grinding process reveals the sophisticated flavor profiles that medieval cooks achieved through techniques that combined multiple aromatics in complex proportions. A single sauce might contain 15 different spices, each ground to specific consistencies and added at precise moments during the cooking process. Medieval recipe collections read like alchemical treatises, with mysterious proportions and cryptic instructions that required years of experience to interpret correctly. Bread production for the feast involves baking quantities that transform the kitchen into a medieval factory operation. 47 guests will consume an estimated 200 loaves of various types white bread for the high table, brown bread for lesser guests, trencher bread for serving platters, and decorative breads shaped into elaborate designs that serve as both food and table decoration. The ovens must run continuously for 3 days, and timing the baking schedule requires mathematical skills that would challenge modern production managers. The oven management reveals medieval baking as a precise science that coordinated multiple batches according to temperature requirements and cooking times. Bread requires the highest heat from freshly fired ovens, followed by pastries that bake in moderately hot conditions, and finally slow-cooked dishes that use the residual heat as ovens cool down. Master William has developed timing charts that coordinate these cycles to maximize oven efficiency while ensuring that every item finishes cooking at the proper moment. Medieval pastry work demonstrates artistic skills that rival modern cake decorating in complexity and far exceed it in difficulty. Without modern tools or ingredients, medieval bakers created elaborate sculptures from pastry dough castles with working drawbridges, ships with edible sails, and mythical creatures that required engineering knowledge to construct. You're assigned to making simple pastry roses, and your fumbling attempts produce shapes that look more like abstract art than flowers. The sauce preparation reveals medieval cooking as sophisticated chemistry that created complex flavors through techniques that modern chefs are rediscovering. Medieval sauces combined sweet and sour elements in proportions that enhanced both meat and vegetable dishes, used wine and vinegar in precise ratios that balanced acidity, and incorporated spices in layers that created depth and complexity. Each sauce requires hours of preparation and constant attention to prevent burning or curdling. Sugar work represents the pinnacle of medieval culinary artistry, transforming an ingredient worth more than silver into edible sculptures that demonstrate both wealth and skill. The feast will feature a sugar castle complete with towers and battlements, sugar roses that look more realistic than real flowers, and candied fruits arranged in patterns that tell stories from classical mythology. You're assigned to the most basic sugar tasks, and even those challenge your coordination and patience beyond their limits. The timing coordination for feast preparation requires skills that would challenge modern project managers. Every dish has specific preparation and cooking times that must align perfectly with service schedules, oven availability, and the complex social protocols that govern medieval dining. Master William uses a system of notched sticks and knotted strings to track dozens of simultaneous processes, and falling behind schedule isn't just inconvenient, it's catastrophic. Medieval table decoration involves creating elaborate displays that transform the dining hall into a theatrical stage where food presentation tells stories and demonstrates themes. Peacocks are roasted and then reassembled with their feathers to create the illusion that living birds are serving themselves for dinner. Pies are designed to release live birds when cut open, Jellies are molded into shapes that represent heraldic symbols and family crests. Every element serves multiple purposes as food, entertainment, and social messaging. The logistics of serving a medieval feast to 68 people simultaneously with no modern warming equipment requires coordination that would challenge military operations. Hot dishes must reach the table at precisely the right temperature. Cold dishes must remain fresh without refrigeration. And the sequence of service must follow social protocols that determine who eats what in which order. Timing mistakes can result in cold food, social embarrassment, and career-ending disasters. Kitchen staff assignments for a feast day resemble military deployments, with each person responsible for specific tasks that must be executed flawlessly under extreme time pressure. You're assigned to sauce stirring, a job that sounds simple until you realize that stopping to rest or allowing your attention to wander for even moments can result in burned sauces that ruin hours of preparation and cost ingredients worth more than your annual wages. The physical demands of feast preparation push human endurance beyond normal limits. Kitchen workers begin before dawn and continue past midnight, standing on stone floors, working over hot fires, and maintaining intense concentration for 18-hour days. Your feet develop blisters that make walking painful, your back aches from constant bending and lifting, and your hands suffer burns, cuts, and chemical damage from constant exposure to hot surfaces and caustic cleaning solutions. Medieval feast preparation culminates in a crescendo of activity that transforms the kitchen into controlled chaos, where split-second timing determines success or failure. Dozens of dishes must finish cooking simultaneously. Service staff must coordinate complex delivery schedules, and kitchen workers must maintain quality standards while working at speeds that blur the line between efficiency and panic. You realize that surviving feast preparation requires not just physical stamina but mental toughness that pushes human capabilities to their absolute limits. The sound that wakes you from your brief, exhausted sleep isn't the usual tolling of the chapel bell or the gentle stirring of your fellow servansets, the sharp crack of a wooden rod against your sleeping pallet, and the voice of Thomas, the steward, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a blade through silk. Up, now. The Lord requires your immediate attention in the courtyard. The tone carries an undertone that makes your stomach drop, because when medieval servants are summoned with that particular combination of urgency and formality, it usually means someone has transgressed against the complex web of rules that govern castle life, and punishment is about to be administered. You stumble through the darkness, pulling on your rough woolen tunic with hands that still bear the burns and cuts from yesterday's feast preparation, and make your way to the castle's main courtyard. The scene that greets you in the flickering torchlight looks like something from a medieval morality play. Lord Aldrich stands on the steps leading to the great hall, his face set in the stern expression reserved for moments when noble authority must be displayed for educational purposes. Around the courtyard's perimeter stand the household servants, guards, and various retainers, all arranged according to their social status and all wearing the carefully neutral expressions of people who have witnessed these proceedings before. In the center of the courtyard, looking significantly smaller than he did yesterday when he was confidently explaining proper turnip peeling techniques, stands Peter the kitchen boy. His crime, according to the formal announcement that Thomas reads from a parchment scroll, was stealing a loaf of white bread intended for the Lord's table and sharing it with his younger sister, who works in the village as a seamstress. The theft was discovered when the exact count of loaves came up short during the feast preparation inventory, and Peter's guilt was confirmed through what medieval people considered thorough investigation, namely, asking him directly and watching his face turn red. Medieval justice operated on principles that combined practical necessity with theatrical demonstration, creating punishments that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Peter's theft wasn't just a crime against property, it was a violation of the trust that held the entire household system together, a disruption of the social order that distinguished between different grades of people and their corresponding entitlements, and a challenge to the authority structures that kept 43 people living and working together in relative harmony. The punishment itself reveals the creative brutality that medieval authorities brought to the task of maintaining social order through public humiliation. Peter will spend the next 3 days locked in the pillory that stands in the village square, his head and hands trapped between wooden boards while passers-by can observe his shame and perhaps learn valuable lessons about the consequences of theft. But before his public humiliation begins, he must endure a preliminary punishment here in the castle courtyard, where his fellow servants can witness the consequences of stepping outside established boundaries. Master William emerges from the great hall carrying a leather strap that has seen extensive use in similar educational demonstrations. Medieval households maintained discipline through a combination of economic pressure. Servants who misbehaved could be dismissed without references, and physical punishment that reinforced social hierarchies through direct, unmistakable demonstrations of power. The strap in Master William's hand represents authority that extends far beyond the kitchen, authority that can transform a person's life from relative comfort to desperate poverty with a few well-placed strikes. 10 lashes. Lord Aldrich announces, his voice carrying across the courtyard with the authority of someone whose word shapes the daily reality of everyone present. Let this serve as a reminder that theft, regardless of motive or circumstance, undermines the trust upon which this household depends. Medieval justice didn't recognize modern concepts like mitigating circumstances or proportional punishment. The act of theft was complete the moment Peter took bread that didn't belong to him, and his reasons for doing so were irrelevant to the punishment he would receive. The whipping itself unfolds with the ritualized efficiency of a religious ceremony, complete with specific procedures that maximize both the physical impact and the psychological effect. Peter's hands are tied to a wooden post. His shirt is removed to expose his back, and Master William positions himself to deliver strokes that will leave marks visible for weeks. Medieval punishments were designed to create lasting reminders that would discourage future transgressions, and the scars from this whipping will serve as permanent testimony to the consequences of challenging established authority. You watch the proceedings with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a system of justice that operates according to principles fundamentally different from anything you've previously experienced. Each stroke of the leather strap creates a sound that echoes off the stone walls, followed by Peter's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain dignity while experiencing pain that strips away pretense and reduces him to basic human responses. Medieval servants learned to watch these punishments with expressions that showed appropriate concern without suggesting sympathy that might be interpreted as criticism of noble justice. Historians still argue whether medieval justice was more or less humane than modern systems when considering the totality of consequences, but there's no debating the immediate, visceral impact it had on everyone who witnessed it. Peter's punishment serves multiple educational purposes. It demonstrates the consequences of theft, reinforces social hierarchies that distinguish between different classes of people, and reminds everyone present that their comfortable positions within the household depend on strict adherence to established rules. The psychological impact of witnessing medieval punishment extends far beyond the immediate lesson about theft. You realize that every servant in the courtyard is mentally reviewing their own recent actions, searching for transgressions that might result in similar treatment. Medieval household management relied heavily on this kind of anticipatory self-regulation, where the fear of punishment prevented far more violations than actual punishment corrected. Agnes steps forward after the whipping concludes, carrying a wooden bucket filled with salt water that will be used to clean Peter's wounds. Medieval medical understanding emphasized the importance of preventing infection, though their methods often caused as much pain as the original injury. The saltwater treatment serves dual purpose. It reduces the risk of dangerous infection while adding an additional layer of discomfort that reinforces the punishment's educational value. The aftermath of Peter's punishment reveals the complex social dynamics that govern medieval servant relationships. Some servants offer quiet expressions of sympathy when they think supervisors aren't watching. Others maintain careful distance to avoid any suggestion that they condone theft. And a few seem genuinely convinced that Peter deserved worse treatment for violating the trust that protects everyone's position. Medieval communities developed intricate systems of social support and exclusion that determined who received help during difficult times and who faced their troubles alone. Your own position becomes significantly more precarious as Lord Aldrich's attention turns to the broader question of household discipline and the prevention of future thefts. Thomas announces that all servants will be subject to increased supervision during meal times, random searches of personal belongings, and stricter accounting procedures that will make it virtually impossible to take even the smallest items without detection. Medieval security systems relied heavily on human surveillance and collective responsibility that made every servant partially accountable for everyone else's behavior. The village pillory where Peter will complete his punishment represents medieval justice's emphasis on community involvement in maintaining social order. Located in the market square where maximum numbers of people can observe his humiliation, the pillory transforms punishment into public entertainment while reinforcing social boundaries that separate law-abiding citizens from criminals. Medieval communities understood shame as a powerful deterrent that could be more effective than physical punishment in preventing future violations. The 3 days Peter will spend in the pillory involve exposure to weather, public ridicule, and the throwing of various unpleasant substances by community members who want to demonstrate their own adherence to social norms. Medieval justice operated on the principle that public humiliation created lasting impressions that would discourage both the criminal and potential imitators from future violations. The pillory served as a constantly visible reminder of what happened to people who stepped outside established boundaries. Medieval crime and punishment operated within a framework that modern people often find difficult to understand because it prioritized social stability over individual rights in ways that seem harsh by contemporary standards. Peter's theft of a single loaf of bread triggers consequences that could affect his ability to find employment, marry respectably, or maintain social relationships for years to come. Medieval communities were small enough that reputations followed people throughout their lives, and criminal records were literally written on bodies through scars and missing limbs. The economic impact of Peter's punishment extends beyond his personal suffering to affect his family and social network in ways that demonstrate the interconnected nature of medieval society. His sister in the village will face suspicion and reduced opportunities because of her association with a known thief. His prospects for marriage will be severely damaged by his criminal record, and his ability to find employment in other households will be compromised by the need for character references that he can no longer obtain. The bread that caused Peter's downfall represents more than simple food. It symbolizes the complex relationships between social classes and the careful rationing of privileges that maintained household hierarchies. White bread was a luxury item that required expensive flour, skilled baking, and considerable fuel for oven heating. By taking white bread instead of the brown bread that servants normally ate, Peter wasn't just stealing food, was claiming a privilege that belonged to higher social ranks. Medieval household accounting systems tracked every item with precision that would impress modern inventory management systems, partly because resources were genuinely scarce and partly because maintaining accurate counts prevented the kind of theft that Peter attempted. The discovery of his crime through bread counting demonstrates the effectiveness of medieval record-keeping in detecting violations that might seem minor by modern standards but threatened the delicate resource management that kept households functioning. The collective punishment that follows Peter's individual crime affects every servant in the household through increased surveillance, reduced privileges, and stricter enforcement of existing rules. Medieval justice operated on the principle that communities were responsible for the behavior of their members, and Peter's theft reflects poorly on the entire servant population. Everyone will face consequences for his individual decision, creating social pressure that makes future violations less likely. The long-term implications of witnessing medieval punishment shape your understanding of servant life in ways that go far beyond the immediate lesson about theft. You realize that every aspect of your existence is subject to scrutiny, evaluation, and potential punishment by authorities whose power over your life is essentially absolute. Medieval servants lived with constant awareness that a single mistake could result in consequences that extended far beyond the immediate error. The contrast between Peter's crime and punishment illuminates the different values that governed medieval society compared to modern notions of proportional justice. A loaf of bread worth perhaps a day's wages results in punishment that affects Peter's life prospects for years to come, demonstrating that medieval justice prioritized deterrence and social control over rehabilitation or proportional response. The system worked by making the consequences of crime so severe that potential criminals would think twice before risking punishment. As Peter is led away to begin his time in the village pillory, you understand that you've witnessed more than just individual punishment. You've seen a demonstration of the power structures that govern every aspect of medieval life. The message is clear. Step outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior, and the system will respond with force that can destroy not just your immediate comfort but your long-term prospects for survival and advancement in a world where reputation and social standing determine everything from employment opportunities to marriage prospects. The castle in winter becomes a stone tomb where warmth goes to die, and you're about to discover that the phrase medieval heating is essentially an oxymoron that would be amusing if you weren't slowly freezing to death. January has arrived with the subtlety of a Viking raid, bringing temperatures that turn your breath into clouds and make the stone walls radiate cold like malevolent spirits determined to suck every calorie from your already undernourished body. Welcome to medieval winter, where central heating is still 6 centuries in the future and your primary relationship with fire involves desperately hugging whatever pathetic flames you can find. The Great Hall, which seemed vast and impressive during warmer months, now reveals itself as a carefully designed refrigeration unit that happens to have a roof. The massive stone walls that provided excellent defense against human enemies prove utterly useless against winter's assault, conducting cold from the outside air directly into the living spaces with the efficiency of medieval air conditioning running in reverse. The enormous fireplace at one end of the hall creates a small zone of relative warmth that extends perhaps 6 feet from the hearth, beyond which the temperature drops so dramatically that you can watch your breath form ice crystals in the air. Your sleeping quarters, which were never comfortable to begin with, now qualify as a medieval torture chamber designed by someone with a particularly cruel imagination and an advanced understanding of hypothermia. The straw-filled pallet that serves as your bed provides about as much insulation as a sheet of parchment, and the single woolen blanket you share with 2 other servants has developed holes that allow Arctic air to circulate freely around your shivering body. Medieval servants learned to sleep fully clothed, huddled together for warmth, and still woke up with frost coating their hair and eyelashes. The morning routine becomes an exercise in survival that challenges every assumption you've ever had about basic human comfort. The water bucket in your quarters has frozen solid overnight, creating a block of ice that requires chipping with a knife to obtain even small amounts of liquid for washing. Medieval people understood that water expanded when it froze. Several servants have discovered cracked pottery the hard way when they forgot to empty containers before the temperature dropped below freezing. Fire management becomes the single most important skill for winter survival, requiring knowledge that combines chemistry, engineering, and desperate resourcefulness in proportions that would challenge modern Eagle Scouts. Every fire in the castle must be carefully tended throughout the night to prevent the catastrophic heat loss that occurs when flames die down. Servants work in shifts to maintain fires in the Great Hall, the Lord's chambers, the kitchen, and the few other areas where warmth is considered essential for survival rather than luxury. The wood consumption during winter months represents a massive logistical operation that began months earlier with tree cutting, seasoning, and storage in quantities that would supply a modern lumber yard. Each fireplace consumes enormous amounts of fuel. The Great Hall's main fire burns through several large logs every hour, and smaller fires throughout the castle require constant feeding to maintain even minimal warmth. You spend hours each day carrying wood from storage areas to various fireplaces, and your arms develop muscles that medieval warriors would respect. Historians still argue whether medieval people were actually more cold-tolerant than modern populations, or whether they simply had no choice but to endure conditions that would hospitalize contemporary individuals. But there's no debate about the devastating impact that winter cold had on health, productivity, and basic survival. Medieval winter mortality rates spiked dramatically during the coldest months, and servants were particularly vulnerable due to their poor nutrition, inadequate clothing, and exposure to extreme conditions. The kitchen, normally the warmest area of the castle due to constant cooking fires, becomes the epicenter of a desperate battle between human comfort and fuel conservation. Master William maintains the cooking fires at levels necessary for food preparation, but the heat doesn't extend far beyond the immediate cooking areas, and servants working at preparation tables just a few feet from the fires still suffer from numbed fingers and chattering teeth that make complex tasks nearly impossible. Medieval clothing in winter reveals the limitations of pre-industrial textile production and the harsh realities of servant economics. Your woolen tunic, which seemed adequate during autumn, now feels like wearing a fishing net in a blizzard. Medieval people understood layering in principle, but servants rarely owned enough clothing to create effective insulation systems. You wear everything you own simultaneously, both tunics, your cloak over everything, and rags wrapped around your hands and feet, and you're still cold enough that your body never stops shivering. The concept of heated rooms existed only in the fantasies of people who hadn't yet invented effective heating systems. Medieval nobles enjoyed slightly better conditions through the luxury of personal fireplaces, thick tapestries that provided some insulation, and the ability to remain in heated areas while servants handled outdoor tasks. But even Lord Aldrich suffers from winter conditions that would be considered uninhabitable by modern standards, and his demands for personal comfort place additional burdens on servants who must maintain his warmth while sacrificing their own. Water management in winter becomes a complex logistical challenge that makes summer's water carrying seem like pleasant exercise. Wells freeze, pipes burst, and the simple act of washing becomes an ordeal that risks frostbite on exposed skin. Medieval people developed various strategies for managing water in freezing conditions, storing it in insulated containers, adding salt to prevent freezing, and using it sparingly to avoid the need for frequent trips to frozen sources. The castle's design features that seemed charming during warmer months now reveal themselves as architectural nightmares that channel cold air throughout the living spaces with devastating efficiency. Arrow slits designed for defense create wind tunnels that bring Arctic air directly into rooms. Spiral staircases act as chimneys that draw warm air upward and replace it with freezing drafts. And the tall ceilings that demonstrated medieval grandeur now serve as vast reservoirs for cold air that settles on anyone unlucky enough to spend time below. Food preservation, which was challenging during summer months, becomes a bizarre inversion during winter when the entire castle functions as a massive refrigerator. Meat can be stored for weeks without spoiling, but bread freezes solid and must be thawed before consumption. And liquids require careful management to prevent freezing that makes them unusable. Medieval cooks developed techniques for preparing foods that remained edible in extreme cold, though these methods often prioritized survival over palatability. Your daily tasks become exponentially more difficult as winter conditions challenge every aspect of medieval work. Carrying water requires chipping ice. Tending fires demands constant attention, and simple cleaning becomes nearly impossible when your hands are too numb to grip tools effectively. Medieval servants developed techniques for working in extreme cold that involved frequent warming breaks, specialized grips for handling frozen materials, and the kind of mental toughness that modern people rarely need to develop. The social dynamics of winter castle life create tensions that make the normal servant hierarchy even more brutal and competitive. Access to fire becomes a privilege that's carefully rationed according to social status, with senior servants claiming positions closest to heat sources while newcomers like you are relegated to the coldest areas. Medieval winter brought out both the best and worst in human nature, creating situations where people either cooperated for mutual survival or competed ruthlessly for scarce resources. Medieval winter clothing for servants consisted mainly of whatever materials could be acquired through careful saving, bartering, or the rare generosity of employers who understood that frozen servants were unproductive servants. Your cloak is made from coarse wool that provides some insulation but allows wind to penetrate freely. Your shoes are leather that's already cracking from exposure to ice and snow. And your head covering is a simple cloth that does little to prevent heat loss from your skull. The psychological impact of medieval winter extends far beyond physical discomfort to include the kind of sustained misery that challenges mental health in ways that modern people rarely experience. The combination of constant cold, reduced daylight, inadequate nutrition, and social isolation creates conditions that would qualify as psychological torture by contemporary standards. Medieval servants learned to endure these conditions through mental techniques that involved accepting suffering as inevitable rather than fighting against circumstances they couldn't change. Sleep becomes an exercise in survival strategy that requires careful planning and resource management. Medieval servants learned to warm stones by the fire and place them in their beds to provide temporary heat, to sleep in groups that maximized shared body warmth, and to position themselves in locations that offered some protection from drafts while remaining close enough to fires to benefit from residual heat. The quality of sleep deteriorated dramatically during winter months, creating cumulative exhaustion that affected every aspect of daily life. The contrast between medieval winter and modern heating reveals how much contemporary comfort depends on technologies that medieval people couldn't even imagine. Your modern experience of winter involves adjusting thermostats, wearing specialized clothing designed for extreme conditions, and having access to medical care when exposure causes health problems. Medieval winter was a season of endurance that tested human survival capabilities in ways that separated the hardy from the unfortunate. Medieval winter diet consisted mainly of preserved foods that provided calories for generating body heat, but often lacked the vitamins and nutrients needed for maintaining health during extreme conditions. Salt pork, dried beans, stored grains, and whatever vegetables remained from autumn harvests created meals that prioritized survival over nutrition or palatability. Servants received smaller portions during winter months when food stores needed to last until spring, creating malnutrition that made cold tolerance even more difficult. The firewood hierarchy reveals medieval resource management at its most brutal, with different grades of wood allocated according to social status and practical necessity. The Lord's chambers receive seasoned hardwood that burns hot and produces minimal smoke. The Great Hall gets good wood that creates impressive fires for social occasions. And servants' areas receive whatever scraps and inferior would remain after higher priorities are satisfied. You learn to tend fires with green wood that produces more smoke than heat and splits that would challenge a modern Boy Scout. As winter deepens and your body adapts to conditions that would have seemed impossible to survive, you realize that medieval cold wasn't just a seasonal inconvenience, it was a fundamental challenge to human survival that shaped every aspect of daily life. Your modern understanding of winter as a mildly annoying season requiring heavier clothing seems laughably naive compared to the medieval reality where winter killed people regularly and surviving until spring was an accomplishment worth celebrating. The smell that wakes you isn't the usual castle morning blend of unwashed bodies and cold stonites, something far more sinister that makes your stomach lurch with a recognition you don't want to acknowledge. Death has arrived in Lord Aldrich's household with the casual efficiency of a medieval tax collector, and you're about to discover that in an era without antibiotics, antiseptics, or even basic understanding of disease transmission, being a servant means living in intimate daily contact with vermin, pestilence, and the kind of casual mortality that would horrify modern sensibilities. Margaret, the senior housemaid who has guided you through countless indignities and small humiliations, lies motionless in her straw pallet, her face bearing the waxy pallor that medieval people recognized as the unmistakable signature of death's final victory. She succumbed sometime during the night to what modern medicine would probably identify as pneumonia complicated by malnutrition and exposure, but what medieval understanding attributes to an imbalance of humors brought on by excessive cold and damp. Her passing removes not just a person but a crucial repository of knowledge about household management, servant survival, and the thousand small skills that made castle life bearable. The response to Margaret's death reveals medieval attitudes toward mortality that treated individual deaths as unfortunate but inevitable occurrences in a world where life expectancy barely reached the fourth decade and sudden death was as common as seasonal weather changes. Thomas the steward appears at the servants' quarters with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to managing these transitions, carrying a wooden tablet that already contains notes about redistributing Margaret's duties among the surviving staff and requisitioning her few personal possessions for reuse by other servants. Margaret has gone to her eternal reward, Thomas announces with the kind of perfunctory solemnity that suggests he's delivered this speech many times before. Her duties will be divided among the remaining staff. Her possessions will be inventoried for household use, and her pallet will be cleaned and prepared for the next servant who requires accommodation. Death is part of life, and life must continue. Medieval people developed a practical approach to mortality that modern sensibilities often find callous, but which reflected the harsh realities of a world where dwelling on individual deaths could paralyze entire communities. The rat population has exploded during the winter months, transforming the castle's lower levels into a medieval horror movie where rodents scurry through shadows with the confidence of creatures who understand that they outnumber the humans by significant margins. These aren't the cute field mice of children's story theory aggressive. disease-carrying urban rats that view the castle as their personal territory and human food stores as convenient cafeterias. You wake up regularly to find rat droppings on your blanket, bite marks on any exposed food, and the disturbing knowledge that rodents have been exploring your sleeping body while you were unconscious. Medieval rat control consisted mainly of cats, dogs, and various trapping methods that proved about as effective as trying to empty the ocean with a wooden bucket. The castle cats, once efficient hunters, have become overwhelmed by sheer numbers and now focus on survival rather than pest control. Medieval people understood that rats carried disease. They could observe the correlation between rat populations and illness, but they lacked effective methods for controlling rodent populations or preventing the diseases they transmitted. The flea situation has reached biblical proportions that make the Egyptian plagues seem like minor inconveniences. Every person in the castle scratches constantly, their skin covered with red welts that mark the feeding grounds of insects that treat human blood as their personal banquet. Medieval people accepted fleas as inevitable companions, but the current infestation exceeds normal tolerance levels and creates conditions that challenge basic sanitation and comfort. You spend hours each day picking fleas from your clothing, bedding, and body, but they reproduce faster than you can eliminate them. Historians still argue whether medieval people were actually immune to many diseases that affect modern populations, or whether they simply died from illnesses that we now prevent or cure. But there's no disputing that medieval servants lived in constant proximity to health hazards that would close modern businesses and trigger public health emergencies. The combination of poor nutrition, inadequate housing, limited hygiene, and constant exposure to disease vectors created conditions where illness was the normal state and health was a temporary reprieve. The chamber pot duties that once seemed like the ultimate degradation now pale in comparison to the daily reality of managing human waste in a household where several people are suffering from various intestinal ailments that produce symptoms too graphic for polite description. Medieval understanding of disease transmission was limited, but people could observe that certain illnesses spread through households, and they developed various folk remedies and preventive measures that sometimes helped and sometimes made situations worse. Medieval medical treatment for servant ailments consisted mainly of folk remedies, herbal preparations, and the kind of prayer-based healing that reflected the limited understanding of disease causation and treatment available to people without access to trained physicians. When servants became ill, they relied on traditional remedies passed down through generations: willow bark for pain, honey for wounds, various herbal teas for digestive problems, and hoped that their bodies would recover naturally or that divine intervention would provide relief. The kitchen has become a battleground where humans fight daily skirmishes against an alliance of rats, insects, and various microorganisms that treat food storage areas as their exclusive domain. Medieval food storage method: salting, smoking, drying provided some protection against spoilage, but they couldn't prevent the kind of contamination that occurred when rodents treated grain barrels as combination dining rooms and toilets. You learn to inspect every piece of food carefully before consumption, removing obvious contamination while hoping that less visible problems won't cause immediate illness. Your hands have developed a collection of cuts, burns, infected sores, and mysterious rashes that create a medical textbook of medieval occupational hazards. Each injury becomes a potential entry point for infection in an environment where antiseptics consist mainly of wine, honey, and various herbal preparations of questionable effectiveness. Medieval servants learned to work through minor injuries that modern people would treat immediately, and they developed tolerance for pain levels that would send contemporary workers to emergency rooms. Medieval hygiene standards reflected the practical limitations of people who lacked soap, hot water, and basic understanding of germ theory, but who still needed to maintain some level of cleanliness to prevent disease and social ostracism. Personal washing involved cold water, harsh soap made from animal fat and wood ash, and techniques that prioritized the most visible areas while ignoring parts of the body that remained covered by clothing. Medieval people changed their linen undergarments more frequently than they washed their skin, believing that clean clothes could compensate for unwashed bodies. The water quality varies dramatically depending on the source, season, and storage methods, creating a daily lottery where drinking the wrong water could result in intestinal distress that lasted for days or weeks. Medieval people understood that some water sources were safer than others. They preferred running water over stagnant pools, and they knew that beer and wine were often safer than water, but they lacked effective methods for purifying contaminated water or testing its safety before consumption. Medieval parasites were so common that most people carried multiple varieties simultaneously, creating internal ecosystems that would fascinate modern parasitologists while horrifying everyone else. Intestinal worms, skin parasites, and various insects that lived in clothing and bedding were accepted as normal parts of life, though people developed folk remedies and prevention strategies that provided some relief. Medieval medical texts contain detailed descriptions of various parasites and the symptoms they produced, reflecting centuries of accumulated experience with unwanted biological companions. The social dynamics of illness in medieval households reveal attitudes toward disease and disability that prioritized continued productivity over individual comfort or recovery. Servants who became too ill to work faced immediate economic pressure that could result in dismissal, loss of housing, and potential starvation for people without family support systems. Medieval society couldn't afford to support non-productive members for extended periods, creating situations where people worked through illnesses that modern standards would require weeks of recovery time. Medieval dental health represents a particular horror show that makes modern root canals seem like pleasant diversions. Without sugar, medieval people had fewer cavities than modern populations, but they suffered from gum disease, tooth loss, and various infections that created constant pain and made eating difficult. Dental care consisted mainly of pulling infected teeth without anesthesia, cleaning teeth with rough cloths and salt, and enduring pain that could last for months when extraction wasn't possible or practical. The castle's waste management systems, never particularly effective during the best of times, begin to break down under winter conditions that freeze drainage systems and prevent the natural processes that normally dealt with human and animal waste. Medieval people understood the importance of keeping waste away from living areas and water sources, but their methods often failed during extreme weather, creating sanitation problems that affected entire households. Medieval air quality inside castle buildings reflected the combination of multiple cooking fires, inadequate ventilation, and the presence of too many people and animals in confined spaces. The air you breathe daily contains smoke from wood fires, particles from various industrial activities, and the accumulated exhalations of humans and animals who share living spaces. Medieval people accepted poor air quality as normal, but they suffered from respiratory problems that modern populations would consider unacceptable. The mortality rate among castle servants reflects the cumulative impact of poor nutrition, exposure to disease, dangerous working conditions, and limited medical care available to people at the bottom of social hierarchies. Medieval records show that servants died regularly from accidents, illnesses, and exposure to conditions that modern safety standards would consider criminally negligent. Replacing dead servants was a routine administrative task that reflected the expendable nature of people whose labor could be easily substituted. Your own health deteriorates steadily as the accumulated stresses of medieval servant life take their toll on a body accustomed to modern medical care, nutrition, and living conditions. Minor cuts become infected. Constant exposure to cold and damp creates persistent cough and joint pain, and malnutrition begins to affect your energy levels and mental clarity. You realize that medieval servants lived in a state of chronic illness that modern people would find intolerable, but which they accepted as the normal price of survival in a hostile world. The realization that your physical condition is steadily declining despite your best efforts to maintain health and strength provides sobering insight into why medieval people had such short life expectancies and why servant positions were filled by young people who could withstand conditions that would quickly destroy older or less resilient individuals. Medieval servant life wasn't just hard work, it was a gradually lethal environment that consumed human beings as ruthlessly as it consumed firewood or food supplies. The wooden cart that arrives in the castle courtyard on this gray February morning carries more than just your replacement. It brings the brutal reality that medieval servants were as replaceable as broken pottery, as disposable as used rushes, and as forgettable as yesterday's meals. Young William, barely 14 years old, with the soft hands and optimistic expression of someone who hasn't yet learned that medieval life specializes in crushing human spirits like grapes in a wine press, climbs down from the cart with the same eager anticipation you once felt. You watch him survey the stone walls and imposing architecture with wonder, and you want to warn him about what awaits. But you know he wouldn't believe you even if you found the words to explain the systematic destruction of human dignity that defines servant existence. Thomas the steward approaches your replacement with the same practiced efficiency he once used to welcome you, carrying the same wooden tablet with its list of duties, regulations, and warnings that will govern every moment of young William's waking life. The instructions haven't changed, the same impossible standards, the same punishments for failure, the same relentless demands that transform human beings into functional components of a household machine designed to serve noble comfort at the expense of servant welfare. Medieval employment contracts were verbal agreements that heavily favored employers who could modify terms, withhold wages, or dismiss workers without recourse. Your own dismissal comes with the casual brutality that characterizes all aspects of medieval servant management. Lord Aldrich doesn't personally involve himself in such trivial matters as replacing failed servants. That responsibility falls to Thomas, who delivers the news with the emotional investment of someone announcing changes in dinner menu arrangements. Your services are no longer required, he states, consulting his tablet as if reading a grocery list. You'll be provided with 2 days' wages and transportation to the village, where you may seek other employment. Your replacement has already been briefed on his duties. The wages Thomas counts into your palm represent a fraction of what you're owed according to the original agreement. But challenging the steward's calculations would require literacy skills you don't possess and legal remedies that don't exist for people of your social status. Medieval employers routinely adjusted final payments to account for claimed infractions, broken items, or services they deemed inadequate, and servants had no practical recourse against these creative accounting methods. The coins in your hand might sustain you for a week if you're careful, but finding new employment without references from your current position will challenge your survival skills in ways that castle work never did. Medieval unemployment wasn't a temporary inconvenience covered by social safety nets. It was a potential death sentence for people without family resources or specialized skills that employers valued. The medieval economy operated on personal relationships and reputation systems that made changing employment extremely difficult for servants who left positions under less than ideal circumstances. Your failure to meet Lord Aldrich's household standards will follow you to any future employment opportunities. creating a permanent mark against your character that potential employers will consider when evaluating your suitability. The process of training your replacement reveals the institutional knowledge that experienced servants accumulate through months of painful trial and error. Young William listens intently as you explain the temperaments of different kitchen staff, the preferences of various nobles, and the countless small details that mean the difference between adequate performance and devastating mistakes. Medieval households relied heavily on this transfer of knowledge from departing servants to their replacements, but the information often got lost in transitions, leading to repeated mistakes and continued inefficiency. Historians still argue whether medieval servant turnover was higher or lower than modern employment changes, but there's no disputing that the consequences of job loss were far more severe for people without modern social support systems. Medieval servants who lost positions faced immediate homelessness, potential starvation, and the kind of social stigma that could prevent future employment opportunities. The lack of references, work history documentation, or transferable skills made servant employment a precarious existence that depended entirely on maintaining employer satisfaction. Young William's enthusiasm for his new position reflects the desperate economic circumstances that drove people to accept servant employment despite its well-known hardships and dangers. Medieval people understood that servant work was difficult, dangerous, and poorly compensated, but for many individuals it represented the only alternative to agricultural labor that offered slightly better prospects for advancement or survival. The competition for servant positions often exceeded availability, giving employers significant leverage in setting working conditions and compensation levels. The packing of your personal possessions takes approximately 30 seconds, reflecting the minimal accumulation possible on servant wages and the practical limitations of people who must carry everything they own. Medieval servants typically possessed 1 or 2 changes of clothing, basic personal items, and perhaps a few small objects of sentimental value. The concept of acquiring material goods beyond immediate survival needs was largely irrelevant for people whose entire income went toward basic sustenance and who could be dismissed without warning at any time. Medieval letters of recommendation were crucial documents that could determine a servant's employment prospects for years to come, but they were provided at the discretion of employers who used them as tools for reward and punishment. Thomas makes it clear that you won't be receiving any written endorsement of your service, effectively marking you as an unreliable worker whose employment ended under circumstances that potential employers should consider carefully. This absence of positive references will make finding comparable employment extremely difficult and may force you to accept positions with lower status and compensation. The village that represents your immediate destination operates on economic principles that make modern small-town life seem like urban sophistication. Medieval villages contained perhaps 200 people engaged primarily in agricultural work, with limited opportunities for alternative employment and social structures that were highly resistant to accepting outsiders. Your arrival as a displaced servant with no local connections and no positive references will mark you as a potential burden on community resources that are already stretched thin. Medieval social mobility was theoretically possible but practically limited by economic structures that concentrated wealth and opportunity among established families and guilds that controlled most skilled occupations. Servants could occasionally advance to positions of greater responsibility within households, but moving beyond service into independent trades or businesses required capital, connections, and skills that most servants never acquired. Your departure from Lord Aldrich's household represents not just job loss but elimination from one of the few paths available for social advancement. The contrast between your current situation and young William's optimism illustrates the cycle of hope and disillusionment that characterized medieval servant employment. Every new servant arrived believing they could succeed where others had failed, only to discover that the system was designed to extract maximum labor while providing minimal compensation and security. Medieval households benefited from this constant turnover by avoiding long-term obligations to servants while maintaining access to eager workers willing to accept poor conditions. Medieval vagrancy laws created additional challenges for unemployed servants who might be accused of wandering without legitimate purpose and subjected to punishments that ranged from public humiliation to forced labor. Displaced servants needed to find new employment quickly or risk being classified as vagrants whose presence in communities was considered threatening to social stability. The legal system provided little protection for people whose unemployment wasn't voluntary and whose only crime was failing to maintain steady employment. The economic calculation that led to your dismissal reflects medieval household management principles that treated servant wages as variable costs that could be adjusted based on seasonal needs, available resources, and employer satisfaction with performance levels. Lord Aldrich's household doesn't require your services during winter months when agricultural activity decreases and social entertaining becomes less frequent, making your dismissal a rational business decision that ignores the human consequences for you personally. Your replacement's training process reveals the inadequate preparation that most servants received before beginning their duties, creating situations where trial and error education resulted in repeated mistakes, damaged property, and injured workers. Medieval apprenticeship systems provided better training for skilled trades, but servant work was considered unskilled labor that anyone could perform with minimal instruction. This attitude contributed to high turnover rates and poor performance that affected entire household operations. The social dynamics of your departure demonstrate medieval attitudes toward employment relationships that emphasized employer convenience over worker welfare in ways that modern labor laws would prohibit. Your dismissal disrupts no one's schedule except your own, affects no one's welfare except your own, and concerns no one's future except your own. Medieval servants existed at the pleasure of their employers, and their removal from positions was considered a normal business transaction rather than a significant life event. Medieval winter employment opportunities were particularly scarce as agricultural work decreased and household staffing needs declined, creating competition for available positions that drove down wages and working conditions. Your dismissal during February places you in the worst possible position for finding alternative employment, as most employers had already made their staffing decisions for the winter months and wouldn't need additional workers until spring planting season began. The realization that your months of service have prepared you for nothing except more servant work reveals the limited skill development that characterized most medieval employment for people of low social status. Medieval servants learned household-specific procedures that didn't transfer easily to other positions, and they rarely acquired marketable skills that would allow them to pursue independent careers or trades. Your experience in Lord Aldrich's household qualifies you mainly for similar positions in other noble households. As the cart carrying you away from the castle disappears around a bend in the road, you understand that you've participated in a system that consumed human beings as systematically as it consumed firewood or grain supplies. Medieval servant life wasn't just difficult work, it was a form of institutional exploitation that treated people as replaceable resources whose individual welfare was irrelevant to the smooth operation of household systems. Young William will learn these lessons just as you did, through painful experience that will gradually wear away his optimism and replace it with the grim resignation that characterizes everyone who survives long enough to understand their true position in medieval society. Your journey toward an uncertain future in the medieval village economy begins with the sobering knowledge that you've survived an experience that many servants didn't, but that survival came at costs you're only beginning to calculate. Medieval servant life demanded sacrifices of health, dignity, and hope that left permanent marks on everyone who endured it, and those marks would influence every future employment opportunity and social relationship you might develop. The soft murmur of your breathing grows slower, deeper, as the weight of understanding settles over you like a warm blanket. Medieval life wasn't the romantic adventure of movies and novels. It was a grinding test of human endurance that separated the fortunate from the desperate through circumstances largely beyond individual control. The servants who survived did so not through superior skill or character, but through luck, timing, and the kind of stubborn persistence that modern people rarely need to develop. And as your eyes grow heavy with the exhaustion of understanding, you realize that sometimes the greatest luxury isn't wealth or comfort, but simply the knowledge that tomorrow will be better than today. A certainty that medieval servants rarely enjoyed, but that you, in your modern life, can wrap around yourself like the softest of medieval furs. The castle fades into the mist of memory and imagination, leaving behind only the quiet satisfaction of having survived, in your mind at least, one of history's most challenging human experiences. And as sleep finally claims you, carrying you back to your modern world of central heating and labor laws and social safety nets, you drift away with new appreciation for the simple miracle of living in an age where survival isn't the primary daily concern, and where being replaceable doesn't mean being disposable. Sweet dreams, brave time traveler. You've earned them,